Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the sleep habits of the Victorians, trust me. You probably won't survive a single night in their world. Imagine having to rest in a room packed with strange gadgets, potions, and, well, rather questionable ideas about sleep. Now you might be wondering, what kind of cures could they have possibly invented for insomnia? Was it better than what we have today? Or did it just make things worse? Spoiler alert. They tried everything from electric shock treatments to something as odd as gold dust. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the time where you're watching from, so we can create a mini global sleep study in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, let's begin by talking about the world the Victorians lived in. This was a time when industrialization was in full swing, and people worked long, hard hours, more hours than a lot of us can imagine today. The demands of this new, fast-paced world led to an epidemic of sleep disorders. People were tired, but strangely, they weren't getting any rest. Instead, they turned to all sorts of odd remedies that might just have you chuckling tonight. So, how did sleep become such a big issue? Well, during the Victorian era, many people, especially in the upper classes, found themselves suffering from insomnia. The relentless rise of factories and long workdays put a lot of strain on the body. And the ironic thing was, the more people tried to work harder and harder, the more their bodies needed rest. However, they just couldn't get it. And so, the quest for better sleep led to some interesting solutions. The term sleeping disorders didn't even exist yet, so you can only imagine how vague the treatments were. Victorian doctors, always eager to find a remedy for their patients, began experimenting with a variety of solutions that probably make you shake your head today. One of the more common treatments for insomnia at the time involved getting advice from a doctor. But not just any doctor. Oh no, they often had bizarre ideas about what might work, and many of them didn't even question if these treatments were scientifically sound. Some even believed that sleep could be improved by a simple, relaxing potion or a few cozy changes to the environment. That's how we get to one of the most peculiar treatments they came up with, the Victorian sleep chamber. It wasn't just a bedroom. It was practically a sanctuary for sleep. You're probably picturing an elaborate space with heavy drapes, dim lighting, and perhaps the faint smell of lavender in the air. Well, you wouldn't be wrong, but these sleep chambers went further. You see, for the Victorians, creating the perfect environment for sleep wasn't as easy as dimming the lights and fluffing a pillow. They believed that absolutely everything in the room had an effect on your sleep quality. Victorian sleep chambers were meticulously designed, almost as though they were little time machines that could transport you into the land of dreams. Think heavy velvet curtains, tightly sealed windows to block out any noise from the outside world, and even the exact placement of furniture for the optimal sleep posture. The bed itself was considered paramount. The softer the mattress, the better. But what about the pillows, you ask? Oh, they were a whole different thing. Some believed that your pillow should be as soft as a cloud, while others went for firmer, more therapeutic styles that had springs inside them. Can you imagine? It was like the mattress version of a Goldilocks conundrum. But while all these adjustments made sense to the Victorians at the time, not everyone agreed on what worked. Historians still argue whether the obsession with sleep chambers was a genuinely effective remedy for insomnia, or if it was more of a social status symbol. After all, only the wealthy could afford such luxuries. So it's possible that this elaborate setup was simply a way to show off how refined their lifestyle was. What we do know, however, is that this sleep chamber idea was part of a larger trend of what we might now call environmental treatments for health problems. But naturally, the story doesn't end with just a fancy room. The Victorians were also fascinated by the idea that there must be specific sleeping objects that could aid in the process. As absurd as it sounds now, these objects included everything from special mattresses filled with feathers to sleep-inducing amulets that were supposed to ward off insomnia. At this point, you might be wondering, did any of this actually work? Were any of these treatments scientifically valid? The honest answer is, well, not really. But remember, the Victorians weren't privy to modern-day sleep studies, so they had to make do with what they had. And what they had was a lot of strange gadgets and ideas. One of the more outlandish treatments they came up with, a device known as the sleep-inducing helmet, which was supposed to emit calming vibes straight into the wearer's brain. If this sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, you'd be right. It was as bizarre as it sounds. Let's move on to the rise of sleep disorders during the Victorian era and how this sleep deprivation problem spiraled out of control. Imagine living in a world where the clock seemed to tick faster, the days feel longer, and everyone around you was constantly rushing, working, and stressing. It was a time when industrialization was booming, but it came with a very steep price. No one had time to rest, let alone sleep. And the more they pushed their bodies, the more they struggled to get proper sleep. In this new society of mechanized labor, the concept of personal downtime became a luxury, and a rapidly growing population found themselves fighting a new enemy: insomnia. Sleep disorders were rampant, and not just among the working class, but across all social strata. And while the upper classes had more resources to throw at their sleepless nights, their solutions often bordered on bizarre and sometimes downright dangerous. The Victorians were firm believers in the connection between body and environment, so much so that they began to look at sleep as a scientific puzzle. To them, insomnia wasn't just a normal human condition, but a malady that could be fixed with the right combination of environment, medicine, and special devices. They believed that by altering the physical world around them, they could somehow trigger the body's natural sleep rhythms. But what really kicked off the trend of sleep cures were the advancements in medical thinking during this time. Medical professionals were starting to categorize and study diseases in a way they never had before. Insomnia was seen as a serious condition that affected the body's balance, and thus needed urgent attention. At the time, doctors and therapists were eager to try anything to get their patients to sleep, and this was the moment when treatments began to evolve into something a bit more peculiar. Historians still debate how far these treatments actually went in improving people's quality of life. Some argue that they were nothing more than quackery, while others believe that they offered at least some comfort during a time when sleep was a luxury few could afford. Either way, the Victorian era witnessed an explosion of remedies that ranged from harmless but ineffective to downright dangerous. There was no shortage of solutions to choose from, but one thing was clear: if you had trouble sleeping, you were likely to be offered something strange. One particularly popular and rather strange treatment was the use of sleeping powders and herbal mixtures, which were believed to help relax the nervous system and encourage sleep. But these concoctions were often made with ingredients that might raise a few eyebrows today. For example, some sleeping potions contained opium, a common ingredient in the 19th century that was thought to be both a painkiller and a sleep inducer. While this might sound a little extreme, and it was widely accepted as a cure for insomnia at the time. In fact, the use of opium in everyday remedies wasn't all that uncommon, and many people saw it as just another part of life. The funny thing about these sleeping potions was how varied and sometimes, well, odd they could be. The Victorians loved their exotic ingredients. If something was rare, expensive, or just plain strange, it was considered highly effective in their treatment for insomnia. For instance, one common prescription included ginseng herb native. To Asia, that was touted as the perfect solution for insomnia because it supposedly calmed the nervous system and allowed for a more peaceful night's rest. The only problem? Ginseng is a stimulant, which likely only made the insomnia worse. Historians still argue whether doctors were truly ignorant of these effects, or if they just didn't have the proper understanding of medicinal plants at the time. And if ginseng wasn't your thing, there was always gold dust. Yes, you read that right, gold dust. It was once thought that tiny amounts of gold could have a calming effect on the body, which is a hard idea to wrap your head around. But for the Victorians, who saw gold as a symbol of wealth and purity, it must have seemed like a perfectly reasonable solution for insomnia. People would mix gold dust with a variety of other substances and consume it in hopes of falling into a deep, restful slumber. I'm guessing that most people weren't exactly sleeping soundly on a bed of gold, but it sure made for an interesting remedy. But these aren't even the strangest treatments. In a time when people were desperate for a cure, the world of Victorian sleep remedies reached some truly bizarre extremes. Take, for example, the vibrating machine, which was essentially an early version of a therapeutic massage chair, except it was designed to shake you awake and then put you back to sleep. People would sit in this contraption, which would vibrate, and shake their bodies in an attempt to help release tension. It wasn't exactly a sleep-inducing device, but it was certainly a conversation starter. Can you imagine the jolt you'd get from a 19th century vibrating chair just before bedtime? Historians still argue whether these machines were just oddball inventions or if they served as a form of early psychological therapy, helping to relax the mind before sleep. One thing is certain, the Victorians were nothing if not inventive when it came to tackling sleep issues. And while most of these devices have long since been abandoned, their legacy lives on in our modern-day obsession with sleep optimization. The more you look at it, the more you realize that the Victorian era was a time of experimental thinking when it came to sleep. There were no proven answers, and people were willing to try anything that seemed like it might work. This willingness to experiment with sleep aids and treatments laid the foundation for the scientific research we rely on today. But for all the treatments they tried, it's still unclear whether any of them actually worked. Let's now take a closer look at the one-size-fits-all remedies that doctors recommended during the Victorian era. When it came to insomnia, there was a surprising amount of faith in universal treatments, even if these remedies seemed strange. By modern standards, the medical world of the time was focused on creating cures that could be used by anyone suffering from sleepless nights, regardless of the cause. For the Victorians, it was all about finding that perfect solution, something that would work for everyone, no questions asked. But, as you'll see, this quest for simplicity often led to some of the most peculiar treatments imaginable. Perhaps the most widely used cure for insomnia in the Victorian era was the rather unremarkable practice of calming teas. These concoctions often contained ingredients like chamomile, valerian root, and lemon balm plants that were thought to have soothing properties. Chamomile tea, for instance, is still popular today as a remedy for anxiety and sleeplessness. And back in the 19th century, it was considered the go-to option for a peaceful night's sleep. But while it's gentle and still widely accepted, its effectiveness was often a matter of faith more than science. Historians still argue whether these herbal remedies were simply placebos, offering comfort more than actual relief. For many, the calming effects of these teas were believed to be enhanced by sleep-inducing rituals. If you were a Victorian suffering from insomnia, you were encouraged to participate in what was essentially a nightly routine of relaxation, whether it worked or not. You see, the key was consistency. People were told that the body would respond to sleep better if they adhered to a certain pattern before bed. This meant dimming the lights, drinking soothing teas, and often wearing sleep masks to block out all light. A Victorian bedtime wasn't complete without a dose of routine, one that would seem more at home in a meditation class today. But while the calming teas were relatively harmless, other treatments were much stranger. One of the most bizarre remedies involved the use of hydrotherapy. You've probably heard of hydrotherapy in modern times, but in the Victorian period, it took on a more interesting form. For example, people suffering from insomnia were often encouraged to take cold baths or apply cold compresses to their foreheads to calm their nerves. The idea behind this was that the cold water would help reset the nervous system and restore balance. It might sound refreshing, but imagine trying to fall asleep after a freezing cold bath. Still, many believed it was one of the best ways to prepare the body for a good night's rest. Historians still argue about whether cold hydrotherapy was effective, or if it was just a fad. Some claim that the shock of cold water may have helped to reset the body's temperature and help the mind relax. Others suggest it was simply a harsh, uncomfortable experience that had little to no positive impact on sleep. Regardless of its actual effectiveness, it became a staple of the Victorian insomnia cure kit. And there were the inhaling treatments. Inhaling certain herbs, or even lavender oil, was believed to have a profound impact on the mind. Lavender, in particular, was seen as a miracle scent in the Victorian era, known for its calming properties. But the interesting thing about these sleep aids was how they were often marketed. People would inhale lavender vapors before bed, believing they would somehow induce relaxation and improve their sleep. Of course, this wasn't exactly a novel idea at the time. The ancient Greeks had their own version of sleep-related scent therapy, but the Victorians took it to a whole new level. The idea that smell could affect your sleep became so popular that people would place lavender sachets inside their pillows to ensure the soothing scent surrounded them all night long. But lavender wasn't the only scent in demand. Some people turned to more exotic aromas like sandalwood or even frankincense, hoping that these rich, sweet smells would guide them into dreamland. While we now know that scents can play a role in relaxation, the Victorian fascination with sleep-inducing aromas seems almost like an early form of aromatherapy. Whether it worked or not is still up for debate. Some scholars argue that the power of suggestion played a huge role in these remedies' perceived success. But despite all these calming therapies, there was one particularly odd remedy that really made waves during the Victorian era: electric shock therapy. Yes, you heard that right. When electricity was first discovered, it didn't take long for people to figure out how to apply it to medicine. In the case of insomnia, electricity was thought to be a potent tool in rebalancing the nervous system. Doctors would apply electric shocks to patients in an attempt to shock them into a state of deep relaxation. This, they believed, would eventually lead to better sleep. Of course, there was no real scientific evidence to support the effectiveness of this treatment, but it was one of the more popular solutions at the time. Electricity was still a mysterious force to the Victorians, and they were just beginning to understand how it could be harnessed. Historians still argue whether these early experiments in electric shock therapy were beneficial, or if they were just a bit of futuristic overreach. But one thing's for sure, it certainly adds a unique flavor to the list of bizarre Victorian treatments for insomnia. Now, let's take a stroll through the eccentric world of Victorian sleep chambers. A perfect example of how far the Victorians were willing to go in their quest for the perfect night's rest. Imagine a space so meticulously crafted, it would almost feel like stepping into a time capsule room, designed not only for sleep, but for the sheer art of sleeping. Picture plush velvet curtains, soft candlelight casting gentle shadows, and the scent of lavender wafting through the air. Sounds ideal, right? But let's dig a little deeper, because the Victorian sleep chamber was about more than just comfort. It was about creating an environment that could force the body into a state of restfulness. And while this may sound a bit excessive to modern ears, it was the cutting-edge sleep technology of its time. Victorians, as we've seen, had a particular obsession with creating the perfect environment for sleep, and their idea of the ideal bedroom was very different from our own. These rooms were more like sleep sanctuaries, meant to block out the hustle and bustle of the outside world. But it wasn't just about keeping things quiet. It was about creating the right atmosphere. Darkness was key, windows were tightly sealed, curtains were thick, and everything in the room was arranged to limit distractions. No harsh artificial lights were allowed, and natural light had to be just right. In fact, many upper-class Victorians had special sleep masks made from fabric or leather to block out any remaining light that might slip through. The room needed to be as dark as possible to signal to the body that it was time to rest. But let's not forget the bedding. The Victorians had their own ideas about what made the perfect sleep setup. Mattresses were soft, yes, but they had to be just right. They weren't as cushy as modern memory foam, but they were still crafted with precision to ensure the best possible comfort. And then there were the pillows. Some people used up to 6 of them, each with a distinct purpose. There were special pillows for neck support, for back support, and for luxury. The idea was to surround yourself with layers of comfort, creating a sanctuary that forced you to fall asleep. It was almost as if the room itself was a kind of sedative dot. This fixation on comfort may seem excessive, but in a society where insomnia was rampant, these sleep chambers became a symbol of wealth and status. The ability to afford such luxuries meant you could potentially escape the exhausting demands of the industrial world, even if only in your sleep. But here's the kicker. Historians still debate whether these perfectly constructed rooms actually improved sleep or whether they were more about displaying social status. Was it the illusion of restfulness that worked, rather than the actual effects of the room itself? While many Victorians believed that the meticulous design of their rooms directly impacted their ability to sleep, others were more skeptical. Some suggested that the whole process was nothing more than an elaborate placebo effect. You'd surround yourself with luxury and comfort, believing it would help, and well, it often did, at least in your mind. The whole idea of the Victorian sleep chamber, with its plush decor and strict routines, seemed almost like an elaborate ritual of relaxation. What's more, these sleep chambers weren't confined to just the rich. Even in the middle classes, people tried to create their own versions of these calming spaces, albeit on a more modest budget. While they might not have had the grand drapes or the expensive pillows, many tried to mimic the layout and atmosphere. Small changes like dimming the lights, using lavender oils, and arranging their beds in specific ways became widespread. It was all about curating a space where rest could be induced. However, not everyone had access to these intricate spaces, and so for those in the working classes, sleep was often more about survival than relaxation. But these were just some of the environmental changes Victorians made to promote sleep. Their obsession with sleep aids extended beyond just the room. It spilled over into gadgets and objects meant to assist in lulling someone into a deep, restful slumber. One of the strangest inventions of the time was the sleeping mask, which was designed not only to block out light, but to apply a soothing pressure to the eyes. Imagine wearing one of these to bed, a little piece of Victorian sleep. Technology meant to help you forget the world and drift off peacefully. At the same time, there was an interesting trend toward sound therapy. Victorians, who were often overwhelmed by the noise of city life, turned to calming sounds to create the perfect sleep atmosphere. Some even placed small wind-up music boxes near their beds, hoping that the gentle sound of soft, tinkling melodies would help them drift into dreamland. These devices were seen as a kind of antidote to the harsh realities of the world, giving people a way to escape, even if only for a few hours. The idea of sound therapy wasn't as refined as it is today. but it was certainly an early version of what we now know as white noise or ambient music. In fact, it's not far-fetched to say that the Victorians were some of the first to experiment with these soothing sounds as a form of sleep aid. It was one of the early attempts to harness the power of atmosphere to improve sleep. Today, many of us use soft music or nature sounds to help us sleep. But back then, Victorians were using the latest in music boxes and wind-up contraptions to create their version of a relaxing sleep soundscape. Historians continue to debate the effectiveness of these early methods, especially considering the wide range of contradictory evidence. Some say the gadgets and masks were purely a way to sell products to the wealthy, while others claim they did, in fact, offer some comfort and relaxation. Regardless, one thing's for sure. The Victorians were obsessed with the science of sleep, even if they didn't always get it quite right. As we journey further into the curious world of Victorian remedies for insomnia, let's now focus on a truly bizarre invention that still has people scratching their heads: electric shock therapy for sleep. Yes, you read that right. In a time when electricity was still a relatively new phenomenon, Victorians were eager to harness its potential in the most unexpected of ways by using it to treat insomnia. It may sound like something out of a horror movie today, but for the Victorians, this was just another tool in their ever-growing toolbox of sleep aids. At the time, electricity was an exciting frontier in medicine. People marveled at its power, and naturally, they believed it could cure all sorts of ailments, from chronic pain to depression, and, of course, insomnia. Doctors were keen to explore new methods to help people sleep, so it wasn't long before they turned to the electric cure. The treatment was as shocking as it sounds. Patients would be given mild electric shocks, sometimes applied to their heads or bodies, with the idea that it would relax the nervous system and help induce sleep. Can you imagine the state of mind you'd be in after getting zapped before bed? The therapy was often performed using early versions of electrotherapy machines, which were essentially crude, early electrical devices designed to stimulate the body with electric currents. The electricity wasn't as intense as what we see in modern electroshock therapy, but it was enough to make you feel something. The idea was that the shocks would release tension in the body and calm the nervous system. Historians still argue whether these treatments worked or whether they were simply a form of psychological conditioning. Some believe that the shock itself may have momentarily distracted patients from their insomnia, making them feel like they were cured. Others suggest that it was just a bizarre and ineffective treatment that never really had the desired results. Regardless of whether it worked or not, the mere fact that these machines existed speaks to the Victorians' belief in science and technology as a cure-all. They were trying to blend the new with the old, hoping to find the magical formula that would make sleep a peaceful, predictable experience. In a way, the use of electric shock therapy for sleep shows just how far they were willing to go to embrace modernity, even if it was at the expense of comfort or common sense. Interestingly, this wasn't the only form of electrical treatment that was used in the Victorian era. Some sleep devices were designed to use electricity to stimulate the brain in other ways. For instance, some machines involved attaching electrodes to the skin to supposedly enhance sleep quality. Imagine lying there, trying to fall asleep, while your body is being gently prodded by electrical pulses. It sounds like the stuff of nightmares, but in the 19th century, it was considered cutting-edge technology. Electric shock therapy wasn't the only strange medical practice that arose during the Victorian era. At the same time, doctors were also recommending other bizarre sleep aids, such as sleeping pills and herbal tinctures, some of which were incredibly potent. One such concoction was a mixture of opium and laudanum, which was frequently prescribed for those struggling with sleep issues. Opium, of course, is a powerful narcotic, and while it might have knocked people out temporarily, it also came with serious risks. The Victorians were fully aware of its addictive properties, yet it was still widely used as a remedy for insomnia. Historians still argue over whether these treatments were more effective in treating the psychological components of insomnia rather than the physical. Some suggest that many people in the Victorian era suffered from sleep disorders due to stress and anxiety, and these treatments might have been more about psychological comfort than actual sleep improvement. After all, if a doctor prescribed you something that was supposed to help you sleep, wouldn't you be more likely to believe it? The placebo effect was just as real then as it is now, and many patients probably felt better just because they believed the treatment would work. Interestingly, the trend of using medication and electricity to treat insomnia didn't end with the Victorians. In fact, many of the treatments that were pioneered during this time laid the groundwork for more modern sleep therapies. The idea of using electricity to stimulate the brain, for example, would eventually evolve into more sophisticated forms of therapy, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, which is used today to treat certain sleep disorders and mental health issues. But back then, the Victorians were experimenting with methods that were as likely to cause a sleepless night as they were to help with one. And if all else failed, Victorians could turn to hypnotism, another highly popular and often debated treatment for insomnia during the era. The use of hypnosis was based on the idea that the mind could be influenced to relax the body, allowing for sleep. Some hypnotists even specialized in using their techniques to cure insomnia, claiming to be able to put patients into a trance-like state that made sleep inevitable. While modern science has shown that hypnosis can be an effective tool for relaxation, it's hard to know whether the Victorian approach actually worked or was simply part of the hype surrounding the mysterious art of mind control. While hypnotism may have been a step in the right direction, its effectiveness, like so many Victorian remedies, is still a subject of debate. Was it the power of suggestion, or was it a legitimate technique that helped people sleep? Historians and psychologists still argue about the real benefits of Victorian-era hypnosis. One thing's for sure, it was a far more comfortable treatment than electric shocks or opium tinctures. So, when it comes to sleep in the Victorian era, the quest for the perfect night's rest was marked by a curious blend of scientific experimentation, natural remedies, and outright oddities. Whether or not these treatments were truly effective is still up for debate, but what's clear is that the Victorians weren't afraid to try anything, no matter how strange or uncomfortable, in their pursuit of better sleep. Now, let's explore some of the more unusual and oddly amusing remedies for insomnia that were tried during the Victorian era. While many people were turning to herbal concoctions, electrical devices, and even hypnosis, there were also more unconventional treatments that caught the public's eye. Some of these remedies seem so outlandish today that they feel almost like elaborate jokes, but back then, they were considered serious solutions to one of society's greatest problems, sleepness. Take, for example, the popular treatment of sleeping with a full moon's light. Yes, you heard that right. Some Victorians believed that the moon itself held the key to a restful night's sleep. It wasn't just a superstition. People would arrange their beds in such a way that they could sleep directly under the light of a full moon, hoping that its soothing glow would bring peace to their restless minds. This moonlit slumber was thought to have calming properties, as it was believed that the light could help regulate the body's sleep cycles. But here's the catch. Historians argue whether this was just another example of Victorian superstition, or if there was a kernel of truth behind the practice. After all, the Victorians were obsessed with the power of nature, and they often looked to natural phenomena for healing. Then there were the sleep-inducing minerals. Yes, minerals. The Victorians were deeply fascinated with the idea that certain natural elements could have powerful effects on the body. One such mineral was magnetite, also known as magnetic iron ore. People believed that sleeping on beds filled with magnetite could help align their bodies and restore balance, leading to a more restful night. These magnetic beds were designed with an array of iron filings and magnetic materials, with the idea that they would somehow draw out negative energy and help the body fall into a deep sleep. While this sounds like something out of an old sci-fi novel, it was a treatment that had its fair share of followers at the time. Historians are still divided on whether these beds had any actual benefit, or whether they were simply another placebo effect. Not another odd remedy involved the use of hot stones. These heated rocks were placed near the feet or body in an attempt to warm up the body's core temperature and relax the muscles. The theory was that warmth would help soothe the nervous system and create an environment more conducive to sleep. But again, this was more of a relaxation technique than a scientifically proven method. And as you might guess, the effectiveness of this remedy depended heavily on the person's belief in it. If you were skeptical, you might find the idea of lying in bed with a stone beside you a little too strange to ever take seriously. But in the 19th century, it was a common and oddly comforting treatment. Speaking of warmth, another sleep aid that became quite popular during the Victorian era was the hot water bottle. Now we know hot water bottles today as a cozy way to warm up on a chilly night, but back then they were used primarily for promoting sleep. The idea was that the heat would relax muscles, ease pain, and help people drift off to sleep more easily. In fact, many Victorians would fill their hot water bottles with water as hot as they could tolerate and place them in their beds before getting in. Once in bed, the warmth would envelope their body, creating a sense of comfort and relaxation. That helped to induce sleep. While the effectiveness of the hot water bottle may seem mundane compared to some of the other treatments we've discussed, it's a surprisingly reliable remedy that is still in use today. But let's not forget about sound therapy, a favorite for many Victorians struggling with sleep. While we tend to think of white noise machines or calming music as a modern solution, the Victorians had their own ways of soothing themselves to sleep through sound. One of the most interesting devices used at the time was the sleep bell. These small bells were placed around the bedroom, and when someone was having trouble falling asleep, they would ring them. The gentle, rhythmic sound of the bell was thought to have a calming effect on the nervous system, helping the person drift off into a peaceful slumber. It was believed that the repetitive sound could lull the brain into a state of relaxation. And even more fascinating, people would often try to synchronize their breathing with the bell's chimes, as if to create a meditative rhythm that would make sleep inevitable. But perhaps one of the most curious of all was the use of sleeping pills, made from substances we would never dream of using today. In the Victorian era, sleep aids were often compounded from ingredients like opium, laudanum, and even chloral hydradol substances that could induce sleep, but at a great risk. Opium, in particular, was widely used for its calming and pain-relieving properties, and was a common ingredient in many of the tinctures and potions designed to treat insomnia. But while it may have been effective at getting people to sleep, it also led to widespread addiction and a whole host of other problems. Historians still argue about how prevalent this addiction was in Victorian society, but there's little doubt that the excessive use of such substances was a major health issue. Interestingly, the practice of prescribing opiates for sleep didn't stop with the Victorians. Many of the treatments and remedies from the Victorian era laid the groundwork for modern sleep aids, both beneficial and dangerous. The legacy of their willingness to experiment with substances and treatments for insomnia continues to influence how we approach sleep disorders today. But despite the questionable methods and treatments they used, one thing is clear. The Victorians were deeply invested in finding peace in their sleep, no matter the cost. Historians still debate whether the rise of sleep-related remedies in the sea of Victorian era was a reaction to social pressures, or if it was simply the result of a growing interest in science and medicine. Did people turn to these odd treatments out of desperation? Or were they simply trying to keep up with the latest trends in sleep technology? Whatever the reason, these strange remedies reflect a time when society was on the cusp of a new medical age filled with promise, experimentation, and a few too many curious choices. At this point, we've covered quite a few of the strange and somewhat eccentric sleep aids the Victorians used, but the bizarre history of their insomnia cures doesn't end there. Now, let's dive into a particular method that still leaves us scratching our heads today: hypnosis. Yes, the Victorians were incredibly fascinated with hypnosis, and many believed it could be the key to unlocking deep, restful sleep. You might imagine a Victorian doctor swinging a pocket watch in front of a patient's face, saying, "You are getting sleepy, ... Well, it wasn't quite that simple, but the belief in hypnosis as a cure for insomnia was widespread. The concept of hypnosis itself wasn't entirely new. It had been around for centuries, but the Victorians were among the first to embrace it fully. They were intrigued by the idea that the mind could influence the body in such profound ways, especially when it came to something as essential as sleep. And because of their fascination with the unconscious mind, they saw hypnosis as a tool that could not only cure insomnia, but also solve a host of other ailments. It was an era obsessed with the psychological, with what lay beneath the surface of the conscious mind, and hypnosis seemed to offer an exciting new frontier in medical treatment. Hypnosis wasn't just seen as a curiosity for doctors. It became a legitimate part of medical practice. Hypnotists would often be called upon to help people with sleep problems, and many patients turned to it in the hope of being put into a trance that would allow them to sleep soundly through the night. Imagine lying back in a chair while someone gently instructed you to close your eyes and let go of all thoughts. The idea was that once the patient was in a trance-like state, they would be able to bypass their anxious thoughts and fall into a deeper, more restorative sleep. Now, while some people swore by hypnosis as a method for overcoming their insomnia, there were plenty of skeptics, both during the Victorian era and today. Historians still argue about whether hypnosis actually worked to help people sleep, or if it was more of a psychological placebo. Was the relaxation caused by the hypnotic trance enough to lull people into slumber? Or were people simply believing that they could sleep, which then allowed them to actually do so? It's still a subject of debate, but it's clear that the Victorians were committed to exploring the unknown, and hypnosis was a fascinating avenue to explore. Hypnosis wasn't the only psychological approach the Victorians took to solving their sleep woes. Sleep clinics began popping up, where patients could go and undergo a variety of treatments in an effort to cure their insomnia. While these early clinics may sound a bit like something out of a Victorian version of a wellness retreat, they were actually serious medical establishments. Doctors would administer a range of treatments, from herbal remedies to the use of machines that supposedly induced sleep. One particularly curious machine was the sleep-inducing chamber, where patients would be placed inside a small, dark room designed to simulate the ideal sleep environment. The idea was that the chamber would encourage the patient to fall asleep through a combination of darkness, silence, and soothing scents. But did it work? Historians are still unsure whether these clinics had any real success in treating insomnia, or if they were simply another fashionable trend. As we've already seen, the Victorians were not shy about experimenting with new methods for improving sleep. And while many of these treatments seem outlandish today, they reflect a time when people were willing to do almost anything to get a good night's rest. From electric shock therapy to hypnosis, and from sleep chambers to hot water bottles, the Victorians were determined to find a cure for insomnia. Their relentless pursuit of sleep solutions was driven by a society that was constantly on the go, always working, always trying to achieve more, and yet never quite able to rest. But even with all these strange and varied treatments, the fact remains that the Victorians were genuinely seeking ways to improve sleep. The rise of sleep aids during this period wasn't just about quackery or overzealous treatments. It was also about an evolving understanding of the human body and mind. For all the bizarre remedies they tried, the Victorians were on the cutting edge of medical experimentation, and many of their ideas paved the way for modern sleep studies. One of the most fascinating aspects of Victorian sleep cures is how social. Class often played a significant role in determining which remedies were available to people. The wealthy were able to afford luxurious treatments like the magnetic beds, or they could visit specialized sleep clinics. Meanwhile, the middle and lower classes had to make do with simpler and often less effective remedies. While it's true that some of these treatments were likely no more effective than placebos, the Victorians believed in their methods, and that belief alone had a certain power. Historians still argue about the sociological and psychological implications of these sleep treatments. Was insomnia simply a byproduct of the social pressures of the era, or were these treatments indicative of a larger cultural obsession with controlling the body? The Victorians were the first to truly attempt to medicalize sleep in a way that we still recognize today, and their experiments with sleep aids would eventually lead to more scientifically grounded methods in later years. Looking back, it's clear that the Victorian era was a time of trial and error, where doctors, patients, and inventors alike were all searching for the elusive key to restful sleep. And while many of the remedies they tried seem laughable now, they were the precursor to the modern-day sleep science that helps millions of people today. Who knows? Maybe some of the oddball methods used back then had a bit more merit than we give them credit for. Now, let's explore the fascinating and somewhat whimsical use of lavender as a sleep aid in the Victorian era. The Victorians, known for their obsession with natural remedies, had an almost reverential attitude towards certain plants and herbs, and lavender was at the top of their list. To them, lavender wasn't just a lovely scent. It was seen as a cure-all for everything from anxiety to insomnia. And the best part? The Victorians were everywhere with their use of lavender in their quest for better sleep. If you were lucky enough to be part of the upper class, you might have had a lavender-scented pillow, a lavender sachet tucked under your sheets, or even lavender essential oils placed strategically around your room. The idea was that the calming properties of lavender would promote peace and relaxation, making it easier to drift off into a deep slumber. Lavender was so highly prized that it became a symbol of relaxation and luxury. It was something that only the wealthiest could afford to indulge in. The idea that a simple flower could provide a cure for insomnia was incredibly appealing, especially during a time when people were seeking quick and natural solutions to their health problems. So the lavender craze began. Victorians not only used it in their bedrooms, but also in their bathrooms, perfumes, and even their clothing. The soothing scent of lavender was thought to have an almost magical quality, capable of calming even the most restless minds. But did it work? Historians still argue whether lavender was truly effective at inducing sleep, or whether its reputation as a sleep aid was purely psychological. There are some studies that suggest lavender may have mild, sedative effects, but for the Victorians, it was more about the ritual than the actual chemical properties of the herb. The act of surrounding oneself with the comforting, familiar scent of lavender helped signal to the body that it was time to rest. And in a world that was often frantic and busy, this simple act of relaxation probably provided more benefit than we realize today. For many people, it wasn't just about the lavender. It was about the routine of preparing for bed in the most relaxing way possible. And while lavender was certainly the most popular scent used to induce sleep, it wasn't the only one. In fact, the Victorians were quite fond of using a variety of herbal aromas to help them sleep better. Some people swore by the scent of sandalwood, others preferred rosewater, and some even used frankincense, a scent often associated with religious rituals, but also believed to have calming properties. The Victorian fascination with these soothing scents suggests that they understood something we're only starting to recognize today. That scent can have a profound impact on our mood, and overall well-being. It wasn't just about smell, either. The Victorians also employed other environmental factors to create the perfect sleep atmosphere. We've already talked about how carefully crafted their sleep chambers were, but they were also keenly aware of the temperature of the room and the comfort of the bed. They used hot water bottles to warm their beds before turning in for the night, creating the perfect, cozy environment. But when it came to sound, the Victorians were just as inventive. One of their lesser-known remedies involved the use of wind-up. Music boxes, tiny mechanical devices that played soft lullabies to soothe the mind before bed. The sound of gentle music was thought to be just the right thing to calm the nervous system, helping people ease into sleep. While it might seem quaint now, this attention to sensory detail speaks to a larger truth. The Victorians were obsessed with creating the perfect environment for rest. Sleep, to them, wasn't just about lying in a bed for a few hours. It was an experience, one that required careful planning and attention to the smallest details. Whether it was the use of scents, the temperature of the room, or the sounds that filled the night, every aspect of the sleep ritual was designed to bring on relaxation. They were, in a way, some of the earliest experimenters in what we would now call sleep hygiene. But the use of lavender and other scents wasn't the only odd, sleep-related trend in Victorian society. Another bizarre, but somewhat charming remedy involved the use of sleeping pills, but not just any pills. In the 19th century, laudanum, a tincture of opium, was commonly prescribed as a sleep aid, often mixed with alcohol. Doctors believed that it could relax the body and the mind, allowing the patient to finally rest. This potent mixture was thought to be a miracle cure for insomnia, but its addictive nature made it just as dangerous as it was popular. Laudanum was used for nearly every ailment, and it wasn't until later that the medical community began to realize the dangers of such treatments. Historians still debate whether the widespread use of opium-based remedies during the Victorian era played a significant role in the high rates of addiction. What we do know is that these treatments were often prescribed without much thought to the long-term consequences. And while laudanum was effective at putting people to sleep, it was also highly addictive, which led to a rise in substance abuse among those who relied on it to manage their insomnia. But despite the more dangerous sleep aids, many of the quieter, more natural treatments, like lavender and music boxes, were part of a larger trend towards self-care that we still see today. The Victorians were not only seeking to cure insomnia, they were trying to create a space where sleep could be restful, serene, and healing. Whether they succeeded is up for debate, but their dedication to improving sleep laid the groundwork for many of the modern-day sleep practices we now know and love. So, whether it was a soothing scent, a carefully crafted sleep chamber, or even a music box, the Victorian era was full of fascinating, if sometimes odd, methods to ensure a peaceful night's rest. Though some of their remedies may seem outdated or even dangerous by today's standards, they were, in their own way, pioneers in the quest for better sleep. And in the end, it wasn't just about the treatments, they were also about the rituals. The belief that sleep could be controlled and nurtured, just like any other aspect of health. As we continue our exploration of Victorian sleep aids, let's take a look at how sleep was often directly linked to social status during the era. Sleep was not only a personal issue, but also a reflection of one's position in society. The wealthy had the luxury of resting in lavish sleep chambers with thick velvet curtains, gold-embroidered bedding, and the most sophisticated sleep technologies, while those in the working class often had to make do with whatever they could afford. But sleep wasn't just about comfort, it was also about image. A person's ability to sleep peacefully was often tied to their outward appearance of health and well-being, something that became a social status symbol for the upper class. Insomnia was not merely an inconvenience, but a mark of distinction. The very act of seeking a remedy for sleeplessness became an important part of maintaining one's social image. Having the means to afford expensive sleep aids, such as the finest lavender-scented pillows or the most elaborate sleep-inducing machines, demonstrated a level of wealth and sophistication. Even the mere rituals of sleep, the elaborate routines of preparing the perfect sleep environment, became part of a status-conscious culture. Imagine having the ability to retreat to your very own sleep sanctuary at the end of a long day, knowing that your bedroom is not only the most comfortable space in your home, but also the most refined. For the working class, however, things were different. Sleep was often viewed through a lens of practicality rather than luxury. A bed wasn't a space for rituals and relaxation. It was a place for rest, however fleeting it may be. Yet even the working class was not immune to the allure of sleep. Aids, in fact, many turned to the relatively inexpensive and widely available remedies of the time, such as herbal teas or sleeping pills made from opium. The goal was simple: to rest well enough to continue working the next day. But regardless of one's class, sleep was something everyone sought, and the vast array of remedies was a testament to how much people valued the need for good rest. Interestingly, the rise of sleep-related remedies in Victorian society also coincided with the growing importance of mental health and psychological wellness. Doctors began to realize that sleep wasn't just about the body, it was about the mind. Insomnia, they began to believe, was a nervous condition, often caused by stress, anxiety, and the overwhelming demands of a rapidly changing society. As a result, treatments for insomnia began to incorporate psychological techniques with the focus on relaxation and mental calmness. But of course, these new approaches came with their own set of challenges. For example, many Victorians were still deeply skeptical of new psychological methods. They were used to more practical and physiological treatments and were often wary of the idea that their minds could influence their sleep patterns. As a result, methods like hypnosis or relaxation therapy were met with both curiosity and suspicion. Some believed in the power of suggestion and mental control, while others dismissed it as nonsense. But over time, mental health treatment and its connection to sleep began to evolve, and the notion that relaxed minds led to better sleep became more widely accepted. While we focused on the elaborate remedies used by the wealthy, let's not forget that the rise of sleep disorders during the Victorian era was also tied to industrialization and the accompanying shift in work life. The demands of factory work, long hours, and increasing stress contributed to a growing epidemic of sleep deprivation. The Industrial Revolution brought with it new sleep challenges, as factory workers were often required to work long hours with little regard for their need for rest. They would return home at night, exhausted, only to find that they could not sleep. Insomnia became a silent epidemic, and many people turned to whatever remedies they could find to combat it. For the poor and working class, sleep was often a luxury they could not afford, given the demands of their labor. In response to this, some doctors and medical professionals began to advocate for more humane working hours and better attention to the sleep needs of factory workers. These reformers argued that better sleep could increase productivity and overall well-being, but the struggle between economic needs and rest was a constant challenge. The rise of the sleep cure industry also coincided with the growing social conscience surrounding workers' rights and the importance of self-care. While the wealthy sought elaborate treatments and technologies to improve their sleep, the working class had to rely on whatever they could afford, often turning to quick fixes like alcohol, opium, or sleeping pills to numb the pain of a sleepless night. Historians often debate whether the rise of sleep disorders was an inevitable consequence of the increasing pace of industrialization, or if it was more a matter of social class and personal choices. Was insomnia truly a result of the changing social fabric and the pressure to work harder and longer hours? Or was it simply the byproduct of a culture obsessed with wellness and self-improvement? Regardless of the cause, one thing is clear. The Victorian era was a turning point in the way people viewed and treated sleep. The era laid the groundwork for many of the sleep practices we now take for granted, from sleep hygiene to mental health care. But even amidst all the experimentation and innovation, the Victorians could not escape the realities of sleep, its sometimes elusive, sometimes fleeting nature. Sleep, as they learned, was not something that could be controlled at will. Despite all the potions, pills, and devices they used, the body remained in charge, and the mind would ultimately decide when it was time to rest. The Victorian era may have been a time of experimentation with sleep aids, but it was also a time of self-discovery. The pursuit of better sleep was not just about physical rest. It was about finding balance in a rapidly changing world. Today, we have modern solutions like sleep studies, sleep therapy, and medications. But the Victorians were the ones who truly began the conversation about how to create a world where sleep could be both a science and a luxury. And in their search for better rest, they left a legacy of innovation, creativity, and persistence that still informs our approach to sleep. As we continue to explore the fascinating world of Victorian sleep practices, let's dive into one of the more peculiar and often overlooked aspects of the era's obsession with sleep: sleep tracking devices. Before the advent of modern technologies, like fitness trackers or smartwatches, the Victorians had their own methods for attempting to understand and monitor their sleep. While their gadgets weren't as sleek or scientific as the ones we use today, they certainly showed an early interest in the idea of tracking sleep patterns and understanding how sleep could be improved through measurement and observation. One of the most interesting devices that came out of this period was the sleeping clock. These were specially designed timepieces that were supposed to help people regulate their sleep. They often included features like an alarm that would sound at the exact moment someone was supposed to wake up, ensuring they didn't oversleep and disrupt their daily routines. Some of these clocks even included sleep-inducing features, such as soothing chimes or gentle, gradual light that would help prepare the person for bed. The idea was to create a sleep environment that was as regulated and predictable as possible. Much like the Victorians' approach to everything else in life: routine, order, and control. But it wasn't just about waking up at the right time. These clocks were also designed to help people track how much sleep they were getting. Some clocks even had built-in charts that would allow individuals to track their sleep patterns over time, giving them a visual representation of their nightly rest. This early form of sleep tracking might seem quaint compared to the advanced technology we have today, but it was a clear sign that the Victorians were already concerned with the idea of measuring sleep and figuring out how to improve it. Some historians argue that the Victorians' obsession with precision in all aspects of life naturally extended to sleep, and these clocks were just one of many ways they tried to bring order to an otherwise elusive and mysterious process. Alongside these early sleep clocks, the Victorians also used more personalized sleep aids, such as diaries. Much like modern sleep journals, these diaries allowed people to track their sleep habits and any changes they noticed in their quality of rest. People would write down what they ate before bed, how much exercise they got, and how they felt when they woke up in the morning. Some even recorded their dreams in an effort to understand the psychological factors affecting their sleep. While this may seem somewhat rudimentary today, it was an early attempt to connect physical health with mental well-being, something that's become a core part of modern sleep studies. And then there were the more experimental sleep gadgets, like the vibrating sleep chairs or mattresses with springs that were supposed to help alleviate restless nights. These devices were designed to offer comfort and support, using vibration or gentle movement to soothe the body into relaxation. The idea behind these devices was that a gentle rocking motion or massaging vibrations could help relax the body's muscles and ease tension, making it easier to fall asleep. While these early versions were clunky and far less effective than the modern versions we might see in spas or therapeutic settings today, they show how the Victorians were eager to experiment with new technologies to improve their sleep. Interestingly, many of these early sleep devices were often marketed to people with chronic insomnia or those who had trouble sleeping due to stress. Doctors and manufacturers believed that by creating the perfect sleep environment through gadgets, devices, and carefully regulated routines, they could cure insomnia and improve overall health. In a way, these devices reflected the era's growing understanding of the importance of rest. They were part of a larger movement that saw health as something that could be controlled, measured, and optimized. Yet, despite these early attempts at sleep optimization, the results were often mixed. Historians still argue about how effective these devices really were, especially considering the limited understanding of sleep science at the time. While some people may have found comfort in the routines and gadgets, others may have simply relied on the placebo effect, believing that the mere act of using a device would help them sleep better. In fact, many modern sleep studies suggest that psychological factors, like expectation and belief, can have a significant impact on sleep quality. So perhaps the Victorians' use of these devices wasn't entirely misguided. They may have believed they were scientifically improving their sleep, but in reality, they were simply benefiting from the act of believing in their treatment. Interestingly, these early attempts at sleep tracking and sleep aids are not entirely different from the ways we approach sleep today. While we may now rely on advanced technologies like sleep monitors, apps, and wearables, the fundamental desire to understand and control sleep remains the same. In many ways, the Victorians were ahead of their time experimenting with tracking sleep, creating routines, and developing devices to aid sleep in ways that were surprisingly modern. Today, we continue to build on their legacy, but it's important to remember that these early pioneers of sleep science laid the groundwork for many of the sleep practices we now take for granted. At the same time, however, the Victorians' obsession with precision and measurement can also be seen as part of a larger cultural trend, one that valued control over natural processes. In their quest to master sleep, the Victorians sought to impose order on a process that is, by its very nature, unpredictable. And while these efforts were certainly ambitious, they also serve as a reminder that some things like sleep are beyond our control. Perhaps in the end, it's not about having the perfect sleep routine or device, but about learning to embrace the rhythm of our own bodies and allow ourselves to rest when the time is right. So, while the Victorians may have been eager to regulate and measure every aspect of their sleep, their efforts remind us of the enduring human desire for rest and the lengths we will go to in order to achieve it. As we continue to explore the fascinating world of Victorian sleep practices, let's now shift our focus to a subject that might surprise you: the role of sleep in gender expectations. In the Victorian era, sleep wasn't just about rest or health. It was also intricately tied to societal roles and gender dynamics. The way men and women slept, the routines they followed, and the remedies they used were often influenced by their societal position and the expectations placed upon them by Victorian norms. The divide between how men and women were expected to sleep offers us a deeper insight into how the Victorians viewed gender roles and health. First, let's start with the fact that women in Victorian society were often expected to be the epitome of domesticity and gentleness. This extended to their sleep habits as well. A woman's bedroom was expected to be a space of calm and purity, often decorated with soft pastel colors, delicate lace curtains, and frilly bedding. It was seen as a sanctuary, a place where women could rest and prepare themselves to fulfill their roles as wives and mothers. But while women's sleep was expected to be peaceful and undisturbed, the rest was often plagued by societal pressure. The expectation to be the perfect woman extended into the realm of sleep, and many women found themselves unable to sleep soundly because of the anxiety and stress that accompanied these rigid ideals. On the other hand, men, particularly those of the upper classes, were often given more leeway in terms of sleep. The Victorian ideals for men focused on productivity, power, and work ethic. A man's sleep was less likely to be scrutinized in the same way as a woman's. But that's not to say that men didn't have their own pressures when it came to sleep. With the rise of industrialization, many men found themselves overworked and exhausted from long hours at the factory or in the office, leading to issues with insomnia. Men were also expected to maintain their mental clarity at all times, and the stress of these expectations often made it difficult to relax and sleep. Still, men were generally afforded the luxury of sleeping in peace, without the same level of societal pressure placed on their nightly rest. However, these gender-based sleep expectations also bled into the medical treatments and remedies available to both men and women. Women were often treated for insomnia with soothing remedies, herbal teas, lavender sachets, and relaxation methods that emphasized femininity and gentleness. The idea was that women's insomnia could be solved through calmness and emotional stability. In contrast, men's insomnia was often treated more aggressively, with medical solutions like opium or electricity to shock them into sleep. The difference in these approaches reflects how the Victorians viewed gender. Women were fragile and needed to be soothed, while men were strong and needed more intense interventions to maintain their vigor. Moreover, the idea of physical exertion also played into the gendered nature of sleep. For example, a woman's insomnia might be linked to her inability to cope with household duties and family responsibilities, while a man's insomnia could be attributed to the mental strain of working long hours. The differences in how sleep disorders were diagnosed and treated based on gender show just how deeply ingrained societal expectations were in shaping the experience of sleep. Another interesting aspect of sleep and gender in Victorian society was the growing influence of medical professionals who began to focus on sleep as a reflection of both mental and physical health. As doctors began to experiment with different sleep remedies, it became clear that nervous disorders, particularly those associated with stress and anxiety, were more commonly diagnosed in women. This was partly due to the belief that women were more emotionally fragile and thus more prone to insomnia. Men, on the other hand, were less likely to be diagnosed with nervous exhaustion and were often prescribed more physical remedies to address their sleep issues, like sedatives or stimulants to keep them functioning in a world that demanded constant productivity. This differentiation between how sleep disorders were perceived in men and women highlights a deeply entrenched gender bias in Victorian medicine and society. Women's sleep problems were often linked to their mental state, while men's insomnia was considered a more physical affliction, a condition that could be solved with more practical, scientific approaches. This divide is particularly interesting when we consider that today we recognize that sleep disorders are influenced by both mental and physical factors, regardless of gender. Interestingly, the Victorians' view of sleep also extended to their role in society. For instance, sleep hygiene, the idea that one could improve sleep by following specific routines, became a popular concept among both men and women, but with different implications. Women were encouraged to maintain a calming and orderly routine to help them prepare for sleep, while men were more likely to be advised on how to optimize sleep for productivity, making sure they could get up early, be productive, and maintain their work ethic. Men's sleep was often seen as a tool to ensure efficiency, while women's sleep was seen as a way to maintain their well-being and emotional stability. Despite these gender differences, there was also an increasing awareness that insomnia and other sleep disorders were a common issue across both sexes. Sleep was beginning to be understood, not just as a biological necessity, but as something that had significant psychological and emotional components. The Victorians, in their own way, recognized that restful sleep was not a luxury, but an essential part of overall health. And while the remedies and treatments they used were often extreme or even laughable by today's standards, their efforts to understand and improve sleep laid the groundwork for the modern understanding of sleep disorders. Historians still debate how much of the gendered treatment of sleep in the Victorian era was rooted in scientific understanding versus social norms. Was the differentiation between men's and women's sleep really based on biology, or was it simply a reflection of the rigid role society expected each gender to play? Regardless of the answer, one thing is clear: the Victorians were pioneers in their quest to improve sleep, even if their methods were sometimes shaped by the very societal expectations they sought to escape. Now that we've explored some of the gendered expectations surrounding sleep in Victorian society, let's turn our attention to an often overlooked but fascinating topic: the impact of social class on sleep. During the Victorian era, sleep was not just a personal necessity, it was a social marker. How you slept, where you slept, and the methods you used to achieve rest often depended on your position in society. For the wealthy, sleep was often a private, luxurious experience, filled with elaborate rituals, extravagant sleep aids, and specialized rooms. But for the working class, sleep was more about survival, a chance to rest and recharge after long, physically demanding hours of labor. The upper class, particularly those who had estates in grand homes, often had dedicated sleep chambers that were carefully crafted for comfort and relaxation. These rooms were not just places to sleep, they were an integral part of the luxurious lifestyle. Imagine large four-poster beds draped in fine linens, walls lined with soft velvet or silk, and a quiet, controlled environment that shielded them from the stresses of everyday life. But for all the beauty and comfort of these sleep spaces, they were also symbolic, a reflection of the privilege of the wealthy. Sleep, for them, was not just a bodily function. It was a ritual that reinforced their social status. The wealthy could afford to indulge in the best sleep remedies, from lavender sachets to electric sleep machines, and they were able to design their entire sleep experience with the goal of ensuring deep, uninterrupted rest. But not everyone had the luxury of a spacious, serene bedroom or access to sleep aids. The working class, who toiled long hours in factories or on farms, had a very different relationship with sleep. For them, sleep was often a necessary escape from the physical demands of their labor, rather than a carefully curated experience. Many working-class families lived in cramped, poorly ventilated homes where sleep was often a struggle. Beds were shared and mattresses were thin, providing little comfort after a hard day's work. The idea of creating a perfect sleep environment was out of reach for most of the population. Instead, the focus was on simply finding time to rest, and getting enough sleep became a matter of necessity, even if that sleep was fitful or disturbed in many cases. Working-class individuals did not have the time or resources to pursue the kind of treatments that the wealthy enjoyed. While the rich could afford trips to sleep clinics or could spend money on the latest sleep gadgets, the poor had to make do with whatever they could find, often relying on cheap herbal remedies like chamomile tea or over-the-counter sleeping pills. Some even resorted to more extreme measures, such as alcohol or opium, which were both available and widely used in the working class to relieve stress and help them sleep. Historians argue that substance use for sleep was common during this time, particularly among the poor, and it's likely that many people turned to these methods because they simply didn't have access to better options. The social divide in sleep practices also extended to the expectations around sleeping arrangements. For the rich, sleep was often a private affair. They had separate bedrooms, each designed to meet their individual needs. But for the working class, sharing a bed was common, particularly in larger families. In these crowded living conditions, sleep was a luxury they couldn't always afford, and many people had to make do with uncomfortable, cramped spaces. Children, parents, and sometimes even extended family members would sleep together in one room. This lack of privacy, combined with uncomfortable sleeping conditions, often led to poor sleep quality, something that was largely out of their control. This difference in sleeping arrangements further reinforced the class divide and contributed to the idea that sleep, like many other aspects of life, was a privilege of the wealthy. Another factor that contributed to the disparity in sleep quality was the availability of sleep remedies. While the rich had access to elaborate, expensive solutions like specially designed sleep chambers or therapeutic treatments, those in the lower classes had to rely on much simpler and often less effective methods. For instance, while the wealthy might turn to the latest electrical sleep machines or indulge in lavender-infused pillowcases, the poor were more likely to use basic herbal remedies or even rely on alcohol or patented medicines. In fact, some of these patent medicines contained dangerous ingredients, such as opium, which was widely available in many forms and often used to help people sleep. It's clear that for the working class, the focus wasn't on creating the perfect sleep environment. It was about getting some rest in whatever way possible. Interestingly, medical professionals during the Victorian era were beginning to recognize the growing problem of sleep deprivation among the working class. As the Industrial Revolution continued to progress, many doctors began to focus on the effects of long working hours and poor living conditions on sleep. Some even advocated for shorter working hours and better sleeping conditions for factory workers, recognizing that sleep deprivation could impact productivity and overall well-being. This was a significant shift in thinking, as it acknowledged that sleep wasn't just an individual issue, it was also a social and economic one. The medical community's increasing attention to sleep began to shift the focus from purely biological explanations of insomnia to social and psychological factors that influenced sleep quality. Despite these early attempts to address the sleep needs of the working class, the disparity in sleep conditions remained a significant issue throughout the Victorian era. The divide between the haves and the have-nots was evident in the quality of sleep people experienced, and it was a problem that the industrialized world would continue to grapple with for years to come. So, while sleep was a central part of life for everyone, the way it was experienced, managed, and treated was often determined by one social class. The wealthy had the luxury of indulging in the best remedies and sleep technologies, while the poor were left to make do with whatever they could find. And although doctors began to recognize the importance of sleep in overall health, it wasn't until much later that a more equitable approach to sleep health would emerge. Historians still debate how much the social class divide contributed to the sleep struggles of the era. Was it purely a matter of economic inequality, or was it more about the growing demands of industrialized society? Either way, it's clear that Victorian sleep practices were deeply shaped by social class and that for many people, sleep was a luxury that few could truly afford. As we move toward the final stretches of our exploration into Victorian sleep practices, let's focus on one of the more peculiar devices of the time, the dream machine. This device, which many historians now view with a mix of humor and disbelief, was actually a serious attempt by some Victorian doctors and inventors to solve the growing problem of insomnia. While today we might think of sleep aids like white noise machines or smart sleep tracking devices, the dream machine was something completely different, and not in a good way. The dream machine was designed to induce dream-like states and relaxation using mechanical and electrical means. Imagine something akin to an early version of a sleep aid gadget, but much more intrusive. The device was a complex contraption, often involving a series of moving lights, mirrors, and even mechanical vibrations, all of which were supposed to stimulate the mind and help people fall into a restful sleep. The idea was that by introducing flashing lights or slow oscillating movements, the machine would somehow influence the brain waves and help people enter a sleep state more easily. The dream machine was marketed as a way to cure insomnia by inducing a hypnotic or dream-like state, which would supposedly make it easier for individuals to fall asleep. While the mechanism of how it worked was largely based on trial and error, and the scientific principles behind it were unclear at best, the concept behind the dream machine was rooted in the Victorian era's obsession with blending mechanical innovation and psychological exploration. For many people, the idea that technology could facilitate sleep was revolutionary, but unfortunately, the dream machine was never proven to be effective, and its design and implementation were often poorly executed. Historians often view the dream machine as a prime example of how the Victorians' fascination with new technologies sometimes led them to develop impractical solutions to everyday problems. While the Victorians certainly made strides in understanding medicine and technology, this particular attempt to control sleep through mechanical means didn't hold up to scrutiny. Some even argue that the dream machine was more of a curiosity than a practical sleep aid, something designed to show off the ingenuity of the time, rather than something that could provide lasting solutions to insomnia. And let's be honest, if you were around during that time, would you trust a contraption that was meant to cure your insomnia by essentially flashing lights in your face? But the dream machine wasn't the only device that attempted to merge science and sleep in strange ways. The Victorian era saw the rise of many other curious sleep aids, some of which were less intrusive, but still odd by today's standards. For example, the use of sleep-inducing helmets or headgear that supposedly worked by applying pressure, or using light therapy, was another attempt at solving the age-old problem of insomnia. These helmets would be placed on the head before bed, and various mechanisms inside would either gently massage the skull or shine soft lights directly onto the eyes, with the goal of inducing relaxation and sleep. While these devices might sound like they belong in a science fiction novel, they were taken quite seriously in the Victorian medical world. They were part of the ongoing experimentation with how psychological states could be influenced by external forces. Today, we might see these kinds of experiments as misguided, but at the time, they represented a cutting-edge approach to improving sleep hygiene. For the Victorians, the idea that sleep could be controlled or manipulated through external intervention was both a bold leap forward and a reflection of their growing obsession with mastering all aspects of human life, sleep included. The dream machine and its mechanical cousins were just one example of the many strange sleep aids that the Victorians relied on. But in some ways, these devices reflected a broader cultural shift. As industrialization continued to reshape society, people began to view sleep less as a natural, uncontrollable process, and more as something that could be tamed, monitored, and improved. This shift toward medicalization and scientific experimentation around sleep paved the way for many of the sleep practices we take for granted today, from cognitive behavioral therapy to sleep studies. At the same time, however, the dream of controlling sleep through mechanical or electrical devices also reveals a deeper truth about the Victorian worldview. Their obsession with perfecting every aspect of life, from health to sleep, was rooted in the belief that order and control could be achieved through technology. And while some of these efforts may have been misguided or even outright dangerous, think opium-laced tonics, they also reflected a desire to improve the human experience through rational thought, innovation, and experimentation. Yet, despite all of their efforts, the truth about sleep and insomnia, in particular, was far more elusive than the Victorians could have realized. Sleep is, after all, deeply personal and often beyond our control. The notion that sleep could be perfected with gadgets, potions, or devices ignores the reality that good sleep often comes from more mundane sources, like mental peace, a steady routine, and yes, sometimes simply waiting for the mind and body to rest naturally. Today, while we have far more advanced technology and treatments at our disposal, many of the same principles the Victorians were experimenting with still resonate. We still try to create the perfect sleep environment, whether it's through sound machines, adjustable mattresses, or even sleep apps, and we still seek to understand the mystery of sleep with the help of modern science. In a way, the Victorians' attempts to perfect sleep were the early steps in the scientific journey we're still on today. Historians still debate whether these early sleep devices, like the Dream Machine, were simply overambitious failures, or whether they were indicative of something larger, a desire to control nature, even the act of sleeping. Was it their own desperation for rest that led them to create such wild inventions? Or was it a reflection of their belief in the power of science and technology to fix human flaws? Whatever the reason, these early forays into sleep science tell us a lot about the Victorian era's attitude toward health, comfort, and progress. As we near the end of our journey into the strange world of Victorian sleep remedies, it's time to reflect on the lasting legacy of their experiments. While many of their ideas may seem absurd by today's standards, the Victorians were among the first to seriously study and document sleep disorders. Their relentless search for better sleep solutions, even through bizarre and sometimes dangerous methods, laid the groundwork for the modern understanding of sleep and sleep disorders. The Victorian era marked the beginning of our fascination with sleep, not just as a biological need, but as something that could be managed and optimized. One of the key aspects of Victorian sleep practices was the intersection of sleep and mental health. For the first time, doctors and medical professionals were beginning to recognize that insomnia wasn't just about the body, it was about the mind as well. The rise of psychological treatments, such as hypnosis and relaxation therapy, reflected the growing awareness that mental well-being played a crucial role in sleep quality. While hypnosis might seem like a fringe treatment today, the Victorians were actually among the pioneers in exploring the connection between mental states and sleep. Their belief that psychological factors like stress, anxiety, and emotional turmoil could hinder restful sleep set the stage for modern approaches to mental health and sleep therapy. Of course, not all of the Victorian sleep remedies were based on sound science. Many treatments, such as the use of opium or electric shock therapy, were either ineffective or outright dangerous. Yet, despite these failures, the period was a catalyst for the future of sleep medicine. By attempting to manipulate and control sleep through various technologies, the Victorians demonstrated an early form of sleep science. One that would eventually give way to modern sleep studies and cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. Their desire to understand and address insomnia was not just an obsession with comfort. It was an early attempt to democratize sleep and make it something that could be controlled, studied, and improved. The Victorian fascination with sleep was also tied to their increasing interest in science and technology. The era's rapid industrialization brought with it an obsession with efficiency and optimization. Just as they sought to improve every other aspect of life, the Victorians applied this same mindset to sleep. The idea that sleep could be regulated, or even enhanced through gadgets, machines, and routine mirrored the broader cultural values of progress and scientific advancement. In some ways, the quest for the perfect night's rest was an extension of the Victorian ethos, the belief that anything could be improved or perfected with enough ingenuity and effort. But the focus on technology and gadgets wasn't the only way the Victorians approached sleep. As we've seen throughout this exploration, sleep also had deep social and cultural significance. For the wealthy, sleep was a symbol of luxury and refinement. The creation of elaborate sleep chambers, the use of expensive sleep aids, and the ability to rest undisturbed were all part of maintaining a status-conscious lifestyle. Sleep wasn't just a personal need, it was a social marker, a reflection of one's place in society. For the working class, however, sleep was more about survival, a brief respite from the harsh realities of industrial labor. In this sense, sleep was both a privilege and a necessity, depending on one's social standing. The divide between the rich and poor when it came to sleep is particularly striking. While the wealthy could afford the latest sleep technologies and remedies, the poor often had to rely on basic, inexpensive solutions. This social inequality extended to the very way sleep was experienced. The rich had luxury sleep, the ability to rest in a serene, controlled environment with all the comforts of modern technology. For the poor, however, sleep was a battle one, fought in cramped quarters, often with insufficient bedding and little privacy. Yet despite these disparities, both groups shared a common desire, the need for restful, restorative sleep. And in this shared desire, the Victorians were ahead of their time. Their experiments with sleep were not just about comfort, they were about understanding sleep as a biological and psychological process. Today, we know much more about sleep, thanks to advancements in sleep science and neurology. But the Victorians were among the first to recognize that sleep wasn't just an automatic function of the body. It was something that could be measured, controlled, and optimized. Their efforts to tackle insomnia with the latest technologies, herbal remedies, and psychological methods paved the way for the sleep medicine that we have today. As we look back at the Victorian era, we can't help but admire their creativity and dedication to solving one of the most elusive problems of human life, insomnia. While many of their remedies were based on poor understanding or misguided assumptions, they were still among the first to take sleep seriously as a health issue. Today, thanks to their early work, we have an entire field of study dedicated to sleep, with scientifically backed treatments and therapies that have helped millions of people around the world. From the elaborate sleep chambers to the experimental machines, the Victorians' quest for sleep perfection was a stepping stone in the development of modern sleep science. In a way, the Victorian era's approach to sleep was a reflection of the broader challenges faced by society during that time: a growing industrialized world, a rising middle class, and a shift in scientific thinking that sought to make sense of the mysteries of the human body. While they may not have had the answers we have today, their curiosity, their willingness to experiment, and their belief in the power of technology to improve life laid the groundwork for many of the advancements we take for granted now. So, in the end, while the Victorians might have been slightly off the mark in their attempts to control sleep, they were also visionaries, pioneers of a field that continues to shape our understanding of rest, well-being, and health today. As we reach the final section of our exploration into Victorian sleep practices, let's take a moment to reflect on the strange yet fascinating legacy of their sleep remedies. Throughout this journey, we've discovered that the Victorians were incredibly inventive when it came to solving the problem of insomnia. They experimented with everything from herbal remedies to electric shock therapy, and from lavender-scented pillows to dream machines. While many of these solutions were ultimately ineffective or even dangerous, they represented the spirit of innovation that defined the Victorian era. In many ways, the Victorian approach to sleep was ahead of its time. Their fascination with scientific discovery and their belief that sleep could be controlled through external forces laid the groundwork for the field of sleep medicine that we know today. While their methods might seem quirky or even absurd by modern standards, the Victorians were pioneering the idea that sleep, a natural, biological process, could be studied, understood, and improved through technology and medical intervention. Of the most interesting aspects of the Victorian pursuit of sleep was their ability to blend science with superstition. They were deeply influenced by the rise of industrialization and the growing understanding of human physiology. But they also held on to ancient beliefs about the power of nature and spirituality. For instance, while lavender and other herbs were seen as natural sleep aids, some Victorians also believed in the magical properties of certain plants and minerals. The idea that a simple flower could be the key to a peaceful night's sleep reflects the Victorians' deep connection to nature, but it also reveals how their understanding of health was still a mix of science, mysticism, and trial-and-error.in. The same way, the social implications of sleep in Victorian society offer us a unique perspective on the era. Sleep wasn't just a biological need, it was also tied to social class, gender roles, and social expectations. For the wealthy, sleep was a luxurious and private affair, something that reflected their status and privilege. For the working class, sleep was a matter of survival, an opportunity to rest and recharge after grueling work hours. The difference in sleep experiences between the classes highlighted the unequal access to rest, with the rich able to afford the best remedies and sleep technologies, while the poor had to make do with whatever they could find. But despite these differences, sleep was something that united people across all classes. Everyone, regardless of their social standing, sought rest, though the methods they used to achieve it were vastly different. The growing awareness of the importance of sleep during the Victorian era was an important step toward the modern understanding of sleep hygiene and sleep disorders. While the Victorians' efforts were often misguided or ineffective, they laid the foundation for later advancements in sleep therapy, cognitive behavioral treatments for insomnia, and sleep studies that continue to evolve today. Today, we often take sleep for granted. We have access to advanced sleep tracking devices, medications, and therapies that help us understand our sleep patterns and improve our rest. But these innovations are the result of centuries of experimentation, including the efforts of the Victorians. The work they did to better understand sleep disorders, even if it was flawed, eventually led to the scientific breakthroughs that shape our modern understanding of sleep medicine. So, what can we learn from the Victorian obsession with sleep? Perhaps it's that the search for rest, relaxation, and renewal is a universal human experience, one that transcends time, class, and culture. The Victorians' creativity and curiosity about sleep remind us that we are all constantly seeking to improve our health and well-being, and that sleep, one of the most basic and essential human functions, will always be a key area of interest. Their persistence in finding solutions for insomnia, even if they didn't always get it right, paved the way for the sleep science we rely on today. And in the end, perhaps the strangest part of the Victorian sleep story is how, despite all the gadgets, potions, and inventions, the solution to a good night's sleep wasn't really about external devices at all. In many ways, it was about creating the right environment for rest, one that allowed the mind to relax, the body to recover, and the soul to find peace. This is something that transcends technology or trends. It's a timeless truth about the nature of sleep. As we finish our journey through Victorian sleep history, let's take a moment to appreciate the efforts, both scientific and whimsical, that they made in their quest to solve one of life's greatest mysteries. While we may look back on their methods with amusement or skepticism, we can also acknowledge that their pursuit of sleep was a reflection of the human desire to understand the world around us, to innovate, and to improve our lives. In their own way, the Victorians were pioneers in sleep science, and their legacy continues to influence how we think about sleep, health, and well-being today.